Hi, Dr. P here, and I am going to talk at considerable length, two parts, about enabling role-playing game design to fit the theme of the game. And the usual caveat, the slides are very wordy. I expect most people will listen to this rather than watch it. This is a question from a panel I was asked to do at the UK Game Expo. How do you build a set of rules that make a role-playing game fit the theme, the campaign, and the game world? Now, I have to say I design historical and other games and hardly ever full RPGs. Why, since an RPG is my favorite game? Well, Sir William Walton, one of the best 20th century classical composers, wrote one opera, and when he finished he said, "Don't write an opera, too many notes." Well, for me, RPGs, too many words. Now, theme is a word that's extremely ambiguous these days. What does theme mean? Here's a list of different meanings. Theme as a model. Theme as a guide to action or context. Theme as an atmosphere, canvas, decoration. Theme as a gloss or even less. Theme as telling a story. Theme as giving people the emotions of the situation. I always think, can you provide the emotions without doing the modeling? So if I'm talking about theme as a model, and you're talking about theme as an atmosphere, we'll never understand each other. So I don't use the word theme if I can possibly avoid it. I use the word model, which is as much a verb as a noun, where theme is only a noun. So, every game is an abstraction because we're simplifying reality. It could be a fictional reality, but some reality we're simplifying. Even when we model something, we have to simplify. But models have something that abstract games do not. Correspondence is what I call it. What you do is analogous or corresponds to something in reality. What happens in the game has the same character. I'll talk in more detail about this later. Abstract games don't have that, or at least not consistently. Correspondence is needed not only for the theme but for the campaign and the setting. I tried to make a Venn diagram for this. We have models, we have abstractions, sometimes we have something in the middle, who knows what we call it. Now, there are two ways of expressing theme, the functional method or the emotional method. For example, I remember watching a game of Ankh-Morpork, the city in Discworld. And when it got done, I thought, what they're doing there doesn't correspond to what actually happens in the city. But a young lady who was playing it said, oh yes, that fits really well. She felt it worked emotionally. I felt it didn't work functionally. But a better example, perhaps from my own experience, was my introductory D&D adventure through Moria, which was published in White Dwarf more than 35 years ago. I had the party of adventurers, the Fellowship of the Ring, going through Moria, but as an introduction, I would have new players take the characters, assuming that they had read The Lord of the Rings. At that time, the movies didn't exist. And that would make it easier for them to understand what was going on. Well, I used function. So Aragorn, the ranger, was a 7th level ranger, and Gandalf was an 8th level cleric with a ring of fire, more or less. Now, some of the readers wanted these characters to be enormous levels because they were so much more powerful than anyone else. That's the emotional response, but to me it would be ludicrous. So I focus on the functional, believing that the emotional will follow. In the Moria case, Aragorn and Gandalf were still very powerful compared with other characters, like Gimli and Legolas were 4th level fighters. And the only other character involved in the particular situation was the Balrog, which was probably more powerful than those two characters, just as in the book itself. Now, the Balrog back then was much less powerful than the Balrog is in D&D now, by the way. So I just avoided the ridiculous. And also I avoided the problem that old D&D, and this was a advanced D&D broke down when you got much into double-figure levels. It just didn't work anymore. If Gandalf had been anywhere near the level some readers desired, he'd have been God within Middle-earth, which is a low magic setting. So, to repeat a little bit, functionality is expressed by a term variously called correspondence, or less mellifluously, analogousness. There are 3 questions, and I'm going to go through each one separately. Do the actions of the player in the game correspond with what happens in real life, in the situation we're modeling, which could be a fictional situation? Does the activity arising in the game, what happens in the game, correspond to what happens in the reality we're trying to represent? And the third one is, do players follow strategies corresponding to strategies used in reality? So, first question, player actions. Do the actions of the player in the game correspond with what happens in real life in the situation? For example, a military situation, moving a military unit from one place to another, that corresponds to real life. A role-playing game situation, you have a piece that represents each individual person or adventurer in the party. Another version in a business game, you buy stock. That's a player action that fits the reality of business where you have investments. Now, some mechanics lend themselves to this and some are quite the opposite. For example, worker placement virtually never corresponds to any reality. Nor do most forms of drafting or roll and move. Those work in abstract games, but they don't work well at all for models. The second question is the game events, what happens in the game. Is the activity in the game, whether it comes from the player actions or from the game system, correspond to what happens in the reality we're trying to represent? Example of not. Axis and allies. There are no terrain barriers to speak of in Asia. So troops march through Asia in places where it would be impossible to move large bodies of troops. Just wouldn't happen. Worse, there's no logistics, no supply in Axis and allies. And supply is one of the most vital parts of any warfare. If you're out of supply, you're really in trouble. It's just not represented at all. Now keep in mind, by this standard, most Euro-style games are not even weak models. They're abstract and only provide an atmosphere or decoration where it may look like something. It may have the names of something, but when it actually comes to doing anything in the game or with the game, it doesn't have anything to do with the situation. The third question is the strategies. Do the strategies a player follows correspond to something in reality? And that's, of course, related to the mechanics. Again, one that doesn't correspond very well to reality is role selection. Gamey strategies also have little to no correspondence with reality. That's strategies that take advantage of the game mechanics in oddball ways. In fact, one of the reasons why we call them gamey is because they don't seem to have any relation to any reality. They just work in the game. Now, I'll talk more about this in part 2. Thanks for listening.